This is a fairly normal activity at the Stevenson household any given evening. It's time to go check the mail, and so Aaron and I make the journey around the corner down to the pool, and if we're lucky enough, then we'll find some decent mail. It's interesting how, as a kid, I can remember looking forward to getting mail. There was just nothing like getting that personal letter from maybe a grandparent or a friend in the mail. It's amazing when you think about it how communication over the last several years has really changed. More than ever, it's rare to get a personal letter in the mail. It's interesting that the book of Philemon's actual personal letter, a letter written by the Apostle Paul to a man named Philemon, and it's kind of different than any other book that you'd find in the New Testament or any other letter that Paul wrote, because in this letter there's no heresy that is confronted. There's no doctrine of a church that is discussed and dialogued about. It is just a personal letter. A few things that you need to know about this personal letter is that, number one, it was written by the Apostle Paul. Secondly, the Apostle Paul wrote this letter imprisoned while in Rome. Third thing is that you need to know is that this letter addresses a man named Philemon. Philemon seems to be a wealthy business owner, and interesting enough, he was a man who also hosted a church in his home, or what we might even look at as like a life group in his home. It's written about a man named Onesimus. Onesimus seems to be a runaway slave who was owned by Philemon. And at some point, Onesimus comes in contact with Paul. You see, Onesimus did something that he regretted. Most scholars believe that he stole something from his owner, Philemon, and decided to run away. And where better to run than to the city of Rome, where you could just kind of fit in. It's believed that there were about 1.5 million people at this time period that lived in the city of Rome. And so if you're wanting to get away and wanting to blend in, Rome would have been a perfect place for you to have gone. Now, evidently, while Onesimus is hiding away in Rome, he comes in contact with the Apostle Paul. Not necessarily know how the events played out, but my guess is at some point Onesimus became aware of Philemon, because Paul and Philemon seem to have had a relationship previously to the writing of this letter. And maybe during conversations, maybe Paul had stayed at Philemon's house at some point and Onesimus got introduced to him. But somehow during this time in Rome, these two men meet up. And during that process, Onesimus ends up giving his life to Jesus Christ and begins this journey of change that we begin to see become very evident in his life. And during their conversations, obviously it becomes evident to both Paul and Onesimus that it was time to head back home and to make things right with Philemon. Now, you can only imagine what that must have felt like for Onesimus, realizing it's time to go back and confess, make repentance, and do everything that is necessary in order to restore that relationship back to its rightful place. At this point, we find Paul sits down and he begins to pen a letter to Philemon on the behalf of Onesimus.